Hey everyone, welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We've got Brian Batko on, a lot of Steelers questions we got to talk about. What are the lessons the Steelers should be learning from their past failures in the draft and their past successes in the draft? We'll talk about that. We'll also talk about what non-defensive tackle, wide receiver, corner could the Steelers think outside the box and go after in the first round. We'll also talk about who the Steelers could trade up for in the first round, all here in the North Shore Drive podcast. Let's get into it.
You are now listening to the North Shore Drive Podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter.
Hello, welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Brian Batko, we're your Steelers writers here at the Post-Gazette. As always, you can find the show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this, if you enjoyed, subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily your Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes of the North Shore Drive podcast, as well as the daily content that comes out from all of our sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And as always, this show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. Not only will they help you when you're injured in a car accident or hurt on the job, they'll also help you get your workers' compensation rights whenever that's in question. Be sure to call them at 1-800-94-EDGAR, and remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. Brian, let's talk about Steelers in the past, comparing it to now, and as far as what they need to learn from their past failures in the draft. The Steelers are kind of in this position where they've kind of been in limbo, not just because of quarterbacks, but because they don't have many first-round picks on the roster that have worked out for them in recent years. There's a bit of a stretch where they don't have a guy that's their natural first-round pick on the roster from. Whereas you do have T.J. Watt being a superstar. 2018, Terrell Edmonds gone. 2019, Devin Bush gone. 2020 didn't have one. Basically, Minka Fitzpatrick. I guess that's still working. But 2021, Najee Harris now gone. 2022, Kenny Pickett now gone. So now you're left with 2023 and 2024, Broderick Jones and Troy Fautano as the only other first-round picks next to Cam Hayward and T.J. Watt who are still on this roster. And that, to me, says that they need to learn some of their lessons. Now, granted,
the Steelers' social media, Chris, they did an Instagram post this week that was, it was like, typing up the draft, and it was like it's like we're on the clock, and it was, pictures of first rounders, and yeah, they had T.J. Watt and Cam Hayward on there, but then it's like Marquise Pouncey, Troy Polamalu, Santonio Holmes holding up. I'm like, they don't have anybody else to choose from. I guess they could have done Broderick Jones, but jury's still out on him. So yeah, I mean, that one little promotional graphic, I was looking at it, I was like, man, this is kind of sad. They went all the way back to Alan Faneca, I believe.
But that's the point, is that they missed for a while there at the end of the Kevin Colbert era. Now, I do think it's important to remember that the Omar Khan has only been around since the Broderick Jones picks. So so that's part of, I think that's part of the equation there, is that this is a new front office. But I do think there's lessons to learn from what went wrong at the end of the Kevin Colbert era, where he did have so many misses.
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, you can't take a fifth-year quarterback in the first round. You can't take a running back at all. You can't take a Canadian wide receiver with your first pick, and you can't take a defensive player from Michigan. So, and I also would recommend
Kenneth Grant's out.
Hey, we're just basing off their former their draft busts, but no, obviously I'm joking. Every situation is different, but yeah, certainly there are things you can learn from, and I do think the 2022 draft is the big one, reaching for Kenny Pickett. I guess it wasn't exactly seen as a reach at the time, but I think more so than calling it a reach, maybe I'll backtrack on that. Pigeonholing yourself into desperation for a quarterback in a year where, yes, your roster doesn't look great at that spot, and then all of a sudden you start to overrate guys versus who's the best player available on the board. Now, off the top of my head, I think some of the guys who were there that year were like Trent McDuffie, the corner from Washington, who went with the next pick and has been really good with the Chiefs. There weren't a ton of options, but yeah, I mean, I think that's one that stands out. Even Najee Harris in the first round in 2021, I liked the pick at the time, but I think what you could learn about positional value and how you should apply that to running back specifically is like, okay, you don't want to speak in absolutes and say never draft a running back in the first round, But if you're going to, it's got to be someone who's a little bit more of a game changer and all around difference maker, somebody who can truly elevate the offense beyond what Najee was able to do. And I think that was kind of one of the knocks on him at the time of like, okay, good pick, but if it doesn't work out, why? And it's like, well, because he doesn't really have the long speed to rip off big runs and be a home run hitter. And that's kind of what this Steelers offense should be trying to get if they're taking a guy at that spot that high in the draft.
Yeah, I think that's the thing is the Steelers need to. There's several lessons we could take. You running back. We'll talk about some running backs in the next couple of segments because they're part of the equation there. But Najee Harris, I felt like at the time, you were trying to reestablish the run game. You were trying to get that Le'Veon Bell type of back that could be a bruiser, that could always fall forward, that could always make and you did get that guy, but you didn't have the offensive line that made Le'Veon Bell what he was for so many years for the Steelers, and that didn't work. And now you're trying to be this different type of a run team, and you don't have the home run hitter like you're talking about there. But I think one of the lessons that I look at, like you were talking about, is quarterback and not reaching at quarterback in a year where you've kind of looked at it and you say, yeah, this isn't the year of a lot of starting quarterback talent competing with each other. Whereas, when you look at that Kenny Pickett draft class, none of those guys are starters in the NFL, except Brock Purdy in the very late seventh round, and that was your one needle in the haystack that you found there. But there's other drafts where you could find several starters in the NFL, and yeah, there's still misses in those, but you have a higher percentage chance of it. And again, this draft class was identified like this over a year ago. People knew that this draft class was not going to be all that, even before they knew that guys like Carson Beck wouldn't be in it. So I think that's part of what the Steelers. That's one of the things the Steelers need to learn from is don't overdraft a quarterback just because you need one and just because you think this one guy could potentially be the fit. Unless you've scouted this guy and you think that he is the second coming and you got to take that swing. I think being patient, waiting for the right year to go after a quarterback is very important, but also drafting building block players, because that's one thing this team needs right now. They need, they've gotten their offensive tackles; those are building block players. I think the reason that you, me, Ray, Jerry, we've all been talking about the Steelers at defensive tackle is because that's a building block position right now for what the Steelers need. They need interior help on defense. They don't have. Their best interior defensive lineman is only going to be around for a couple years more at best. And if you're the Steelers, you need to start finding the replacement that'll pair with De'Anton Benton for the long term. So I think that's the thing here is do that, but also stay to your best player available big board, because so many times when you've locked in on a position, I think that was Kevin Colbert's greatest sin was, when they drafted Artie Burns when at corner, because they really needed a corner to complete that team, and it was an overstep where they could have gotten other guys. Same thing for Terrell Edmonds in 2018. They were hurting at safety and they needed safety help, so they went and got Terrell Edmonds to fit there, but he was not a first round caliber type player. Even back then, people thought that this guy was probably a third round guy. So there's a lot of things to learn from, and I think that's where it'll be interesting to see if Omar Khan does in his third NFL draft class.
One other aspect of it that I'll mention is not being over-reliant on projections. And what I mean by that is I think of the 2021 draft where you take Kendrick Green in the third round and say, okay, we haven't seen a ton of the guy at center. I think it was 4 or 6 games or something like that in college at Illinois. But we think we can move him inside there, coach him up, and he can be really good. Well, sometimes that works. Other times it definitely does not work. And I think, you need to pick your spots with that kind of thing. They did it again to some extent last year with Troy Fautanu, just moving him from the left side to the right side at offensive tackle for them. That's less of a jump than going from guard primarily to center. And, we now have kind of the full picture of the Kendrick Green experience as it was. He didn't want to play there. He wasn't confident in his ability to play there, really. It wasn't for him. It was a bad evaluation by the Steelers to some extent, and it was a tough deal too. It was not the best job either by Kendrick Green making that transition. So I'd caution about hey, I'm trying to think of a good example in this. I like Shamar Stewart from Texas A&M. We're gonna move him into more of an interior defensive lineman because we think we can put some weight on him and he can be that guy. I'd just be a little bit skeptical of that. I know he blew up the combine, one of the most athletic DN types that we've ever seen coming out of the college ranks. But, be careful with some of that stuff because it has blown up in your face a time or two.
I agree. And I think that's certainly a mistake that they've made, and they need to avoid moving forward. We'll talk more about the draft and including players that could be outside the box options in the first round. We'll talk about that next here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Brian Batko here. But first, remind you, this show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. Did you know that they also do workers' compensation? When you've been hurt on the job, who decides when you're better? Who decides when your treatment's over? Who decides when your benefits are over? The answer might surprise you. It's the insurance company's doctors. If that
I don't
makes you
like that.
feel don't like that, and you shouldn't like that, because they should have the right to talk about that. So you need to know what your rights are. If you need to know that, call Edgar Snyder Associates today at 1-800-94-EDGAR. They'll fight for your workers' compensation rights that you deserve. And remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. This episode is also brought to you by UFC Gym Pittsburgh. Are you ready to train like a champion? UFC Gym has everything for total body health under one roof. They have group classes from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to Zumba, personal training, cardio, weights, cryotherapy, infrared saunas, and more, all for an unbeatable price. Not sure where to begin? All members get a starter session with an expert coach to help map out your fitness plan. Your first visit is on us. Drop in with free parking at Market Square or the waterfront and follow UFC Gym Pittsburgh on social media. Train different. Feel unstoppable at UFC Gym. We're back here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Brian Batko. Brian, I want to talk about other positions in the first round because we want to keep people focused on the right direction. That's why some people's like, well, you guys are just so locked in on D tackle. Yes, because things say that's probably a good chance that they'll take that, and wide receiver and corner are up there. But I want to look at outside the box options because we all, like we said, there's some times where the Steelers will go in a different direction than what we think, and they'll surprise everyone, and they'll go get some guy out here. So if we're taking off defensive tackle, wide receiver, cornerback, and I'll also throw quarterback in there because I feel like that's the other obvious one that everyone just keeps mocking to them. What's a position that you think that isn't being talked about a lot that would be interesting if the Steelers went after with their first round pick?
I think first of all would be running back because of some of what we just discussed in the first segment of, is there a little bit of a burn still there from, the sting of Najee Harris? I don't want to say he didn't work out, but, he didn't pick up his option. I think it wasn't exactly what you thought you were getting, despite 4 straight years of 1,000 yards. People get mad when you bring that up, but it is a fact. He did do that. He stayed reliable, stayed durable. So all those things were good, but I just think it's going to be tricky for the Steelers to decide, like, okay, would we want to invest in a first round running back again and just kind of take a leap of faith that it's going to work out better than it did with Najee? I don't know. This class, it could be one where it happens. Maybe not Ashton Genty, but Omarion Hampton from UNC is the other name that's getting a lot of first round buzz right now from the draft analysts. So that would be one. And then another, I guess, more sneakier one for me, Chris, would be guard. And I'll tell you why. I mean, I think, first of all, they sort of surprised us by thinking ahead on the interior offensive line last year when they not only took Zach Frazier in the second round, but I don't know about you, but I think shocked a lot of people going guard in the 4th round with their first pick of day 3 of Mason McCormick. That was not really on my radar there. But their foresight ended up being pretty wise because James Daniels goes down and boom, you insert the rookie who was also a 6th-year guy and was pretty polished and ready to play right away. So Isaac Seumalo also aging at this point. Last year of his deal, I think his play tailed off a little bit last season. Pro Bowl selection, if we want to call it that, notwithstanding. But, I don't think he was as good as he was the year before. So could the Steelers look at a guy like Alabama's Tyler Booker as a 3-year player for the Tide? He's really young. I think he's still only 20. I think he's got a lot of upside because he's so big and strong and powerful. He could sit for a year behind Isaac Seumalo. He could potentially even replace Mason McCormick if they're not as sold on his work in 2024 as we might be. We know that Andy Weidel and Omar Khan are putting a lot of emphasis on the trenches. that's just one that I'm like, I don't think they'll do that again, offensive line first round. But if they did, would it be planning for the future a little bit at guard?
Yeah, that'd be really interesting. I was the one who did our top 10 offensive line prospects to look at in the for the PG, and the top guard that I had in my list here was, I think, Tate Ratledge out of Georgia. His athleticism was there. I think that he'd be really interesting to see if you could, with the way that he tested, the way that he moves. I thought that he would be a really interesting player to look at there. Tyler Booker certainly is, a guy with a huge frame at 6'5", 321. He's built like a tackle, but he plays like a guard, and that's really interesting. But if they went and got one of those guys, that would be really interesting to see if that would. Now, would that be a reach at 21? Maybe, because I think a lot of people think that those guys aren't Alan Faneca, David DeCastro type guards, but it certainly would be worth a look. And if they completed their offensive line for the future, like, again, you'd be looking at, 2 first-round offensive tackles, a second-round center, maybe a first-round guard, and then a fourth round guard. That could be your offensive line for years to come. And then, when you get your quarterback next year and you figure out what your running back situation is, then that could be the unit that just paves the road for all of that to be so much easier.
Yeah, and I think Spencer Anderson is still in the mix, but he's been more about versatility than someone who's carved out a true niche along the offensive line. And the other nice thing about Booker from Alabama is he was a left guard all the way. And if the plan was to say, hey, we actually don't even need you to start in round one, because I guess we've talked a lot on various shows about, are the Steelers eyeing a run this year, or is it more about next year? If it is indeed more about next year, then, I don't want to say who cares if you don't get a contribution from your first round pick in year one, but it's not as, it's kind of the old school Steelers approach of like, no, we're going to ease you in and we're not going to rely on a rookie right off the jump. I think most teams do, especially with interior linemen, but for a young guy who's 20 and played left guard, could sit for a year behind Isaac Seumalo, be injury insurance if Seumalo gets hurt again. That's intriguing to me. I think Donovan Jackson from Ohio State's another really good guard in this class, and some teams might even take him as a tackle. So I think he could end up being even better than Booker, but Booker might have more upside from what I've seen.
I want to look at another position that I broke down, and I want to look at safety, because I feel like that's even less talked about than other offensive linemen. There's some interesting prospects in the safety class for the skill sets they can provide, and it would be interesting to see if the Steelers wanted to go this route to free things up in their secondary a lot more. My top-rated safety is not Malachi Starks out of Georgia, who some people say is a potentially a top 15 pick in his draft class. I think it's Nick Emanwari out of South Carolina. I think that he's big at 6'3", 220, but he flies at four with a 4.38 40-yard dash. He shows his ball skills. He had 4 interceptions last year. Like, I have a hard time seeing the Steelers make this move, but if they got like a supremely athletic big safety who could play all over the field and be a potential replacement for Minkah Fitzpatrick in the coming years. Like, say, if you don't want to keep paying his contract, you want to move that money to the offensive side of the ball, or just anywhere else. That would be an interesting move to kind of position yourself to have that position readdressed at this stage. Granted, again, I don't think it's happening. I think the safety room is going to be Fitzpatrick, Elliott, and Juan Thornton, who they brought in free agency. But there could be some outside the box thinking if, like, all your defensive tackles are gone, you don't find a good trade, or you trade back and you're not getting those guys, and you're like, you know what, Emanwari or Xavier Watts out of Notre Dame, either one of those guys would really work with what we're trying to do right now.
Or Malachi Starks from Georgia. He's certainly not a bad player. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're getting at there is a scenario where, hey, maybe things really go sideways on you, and Walter Nolan, Kenneth Grant, Derek Harmon go between 15 and 20, and now you're kind of like, geez, Nick Emanwari is the best prospect available on our board, or Malachi Starks is the only blue chip talent we think is still available. I think that's a long shot, because there's a lot more barrier to entry there with not only Minkah, who, I mean, I think we can all agree has not been as effective the last couple seasons, but Deshaun Elliott was so good last year. I mean, if he didn't have that kind of season, I'd be more on the train of start planning for the future at safety And, you could also kind of go positionless football. Like you said, we'll just take a versatile chess piece and we'll find a way to fit him in our defense. Maybe even that's like a slot type guy or playing in that overhang area. But I think that'd just be such a luxury pick. And, not exactly a wordsmith here, but the Steelers don't have the luxury of taking luxury picks right now with the way this roster's set up.
No, I agree with you. They like I said, building blocks are what they need to do right now. That's why we keep looking at the positions we've been looking at. But let's talk about players they could end up trading up for. We'll do that in the next segment here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Brian Batko. But first, we'll remind you this show is also brought to you by Savia's Kane and Gallucci. They're your mesothelioma and asbestos lawyers with over 85 years of experience. Call them today for a free consultation. That's Savia's Kane and Gallucci. Back here on the North Shore Drive podcast, Chris Carter, Brian Batko. Brian, let's take a closer look at that first round board again. Let's put everything on the table from things that we don't think could happen, from those sort of off the radar picks or outside the box type of picks to the absolutely inside the box type of picks, but something that would be so good that could actually force the Steelers to trade up. Now, I think you and I have talked a lot. You and I and Ray, we've talked a lot about trading back. Might be the move this year, just to accumulate more picks. Maybe get back that day 2 pick that you sent away for DK Metcalf. But let's look at some of the players that you might end up trading up for. Are there players that you think specifically like, hey, if this guy gets to like 16 or 17, the Steelers should get a little jumpy? Or is this a year where they need to just stay put no matter what?
I mean, I hate to speak in absolutes, but I'm pretty close to saying this is a draft class where under no circumstance should you make a move up the board, because it's really the value is way more in the depth than the top tier talent. Now, I'll couch that with, first of all, you never know exactly what it's going to take to move up. When Omar Khan made the move for Broderick Jones a few years ago, I believe they sacrificed a 4th round pick to make that move with the Patriots, 120 overall. See, like, I wouldn't even do that in this year, because I think you're going to get a good player in the 4th round. I really do. Like, and I know it was to move up only 3 spots, but I hesitate to say I would even want to trade a 4th or 5th in this specific draft. You've got more capital to work with next year potentially, but that's kind of a slippery slope, because those comp picks, I mean, they're not locked in until they're locked in. So, I mean, it's a little bit difficult to fully wheel and deal, even though you have that peace of mind of the way you've structured everything this offseason. However, here's the other kind of caveat that I will provide, and I think it's highly unlikely, but you never know when you talk about running back values in the draft and how analytical teams might be. If Ashton Genty were to slide down a little bit and he's getting into the double-digit range, which I think it's probably just as likely he'll go 7 or 8 or 9, maybe even 6 to the Raiders. But if he were starting to slip down the board, just because teams are like, no, we've got way too many other areas to address, especially if we're picking in the top 15, that we can't go to this guy, even though he might be a generational running back. I mean, I think it'd be fair to have a conversation if you're the Steelers, because just the more that I've thought about him, and I just think the odds of him hitting in the NFL are so high that I would understand it if you're like, we need to get this guy in here, and Jaylen Warren and Kenneth Gainwell be damned. Like, he is a game changer. He is the potential Saquon Barkley for our, Eagles blueprint type of offense.
He would certainly be a game changer. Like, I think he'd be very different from Najee Harris in that his home run ability, his playmaking ability would just be on a different level in the NFL. Like, I do think he has that potential to be that kind of a guy. But again, like, that's not a building block piece. And then that's further relying on, you better make that offensive line work with everything that you got right now. You better make sure that defensive line works without the new investment in it. You better make sure that cornerbacks still like that's just the thing. I look at these positions, I'm like, man, like I have a hard time seeing running back being that move there. And again, like you said, if you're trading up to get Ashton Genty in that situation, then you're giving up another one of those depth picks that you're looking to build things. Or now, to Omar Khan's credit, when they traded up to get Broderick Jones, they got that 4th round pick back basically by trading down in the 3rd round with Darnell Washington. But at the same time, like I'm with you, Brian. Like I have a hard time seeing the carrot being dangled in front of the Steelers. Like, oh, we got to go get that guy. Like Will Johnson might be the one guy that's like that, because I do think Will Johnson can be a shutdown super corner in the NFL. That could, and if you get that to pair with Joey Porter Jr. for the long term, you could put yourself in a very different conversation in the secondary, and that could be awesome. But like to your point, this team has been building back and building back, and they need to keep building back right now. And trading up, I feel like when you've already don't have a second round pick right now for this year, it's tough to see them to think that they're going to do that, and kind of sell themselves short on where they can find more depth pieces and rebuild parts of their roster later in this draft.
And I don't think that's just a Steelers centric thing either. I mean, I don't think you're going to see many teams trading up in the 2025 draft because, again, who are the types of players coming out this year who are going to move that needle for teams? I mean, maybe Tyler Warren, the Penn State tight end, which, you know, he'd be a nice addition to the Arthur Smith offense. Don't get me wrong. He'd be a nice addition to any offense. But, you know, you have Pat Freiermuth. You just paid him. You just drafted Darnell Washington in the third round a couple of years ago. I know that he's kind of a positionless weapon himself, Warren, but, you know, that's one guy that, yeah, his talent might get a team to jump up, or, you know, some of these defensive players like Jalen Walker, the kind of hybrid edge linebacker out of Georgia, if he falls a little. And then quarterbacks, you never know if Shedeur Sanders or if a team's really high on Jackson Dart, you know, could they do that? Maybe. But I just think for the most part, you're going to see teams staying put and, you know, letting the talent and depth at various positions fall to them, versus, you know, robbing from future draft resources to go up and get a guy that they've truly targeted, because I think it is hard to separate, say, the second best running back in this class from the seventh, or the third best wide receiver from the sixth, for instance. So that's kind of where it comes down to for me. I'll just pick your brain on one more thing with Genty, since we just kind of got on this topic and we were talking about him. I know you said he's not a necessarily one of those cornerstone pieces like a lineman or somebody else in the trenches. I think some people would disagree with you and say, no, he is a guy that you can actually build around on offense. He is the foundation. You know, that depends on how high somebody is on Genty. But I think that's kind of the flip side of that argument, is like, no, he's not just a fast running back that you put in there as kind of the last piece of your puzzle. He's somebody who, I mean, he's going to make an offensive line better because he's just that good breaking tackles, his vision, everything that he was able to do last year, record setting at Boise State.
That would be an interesting prospect there of getting a guy like that. And like you said, like if you're getting that guy, he's that much of a playmaker that he could be that. I think the thing is too is that's doubling down on that you have hit on your offensive line picks, and that's going to be that dominant of a unit. Like for example, when the Giants went and got Saquon Barkley, they didn't have a lot of things in place. Like they and he was their early pick. Like we're talking about if the Steelers, if he gets down to like the 15s and the 16s, and the Steelers trade up and say, okay, we can go get that guy now. But like I forget where Saquon Barkley went, but I want to say it was top five even.
He went
second. There you go, right there. So like that's franchise quarterback. That's franchise edge rusher. That's super. And like look, he was a superstar, but they had so many other problems. And like that's where, like, you know, again, like I'm cool with running backs being drafted outside the top 10 when they're not, if they're not like necessarily a superstar. But if this guy does fall there, I hear what you're saying, that it could be a building block, because if the Steelers run game is just that dynamic, it again next year makes if you get at your quarterback next year and you're that confident, it gives that quarterback so much grace to be like, hey, you know what? I can pitch it to that guy. This O-line's going to whoop tail, and that guy's going to take off, and it's going to make my job so much easier. I could see something like that happen. So,
and I'm pretty sure Jesse's not going to go second overall like Saquon did. One, the Browns have a lot more needs. Two, I mean, I think teams, even though all 32 would love to have Saquon on their roster now, it was like, no, we saw that even an absolute 5-star all-pro stud, that's too high at that position. And three, Genty's not as big as Barkley was.
Right.
You know, certainly got a lot of tread off the tires with how much he carried the ball the last couple seasons for Boise. So I think those are a few reasons he's not being discussed in that realm of things. But man, he is really good. I've just kind of talked myself into, if Ashton Genty doesn't work out in the NFL, I will be very, very surprised.
Yeah, but I agree with you there. But again, like, looking at
or anything, the guy was Barry Sanders numbers last year and
Right.
arguably should have won the Heisman. But I just had to work through kind of some mental obstacles of, first round running back, smallish guy, smaller school, that kind of thing. But I think he's going to be a beast for whoever gets him.
I think it'd be really interesting if the Steelers wound up with that guy and what we'd be talking about for the next few years. But again, trading up for him, hard to see. It's why we think it's there. But hey, we're trying to do outside the box thinking here as we get closer to the NFL draft. We've explored a lot of angles. We'll continue to explore those angles in our rankings and where we see things heading into the draft that's coming up in just a couple weeks here. So stay tuned. We'll keep you up to date with all those things here on the North Shore Drive podcast from Chris Carter and Brian Batko. Thanks for tuning into the North Shore Drive podcast. Remember, you can find the show on every Monday, Wednesday, Friday on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of those episodes, as well as the daily content that comes out from all of our sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, like Chip Tam and football every Tuesday with Brian Batko. Back here Monday.
We've got a good one coming up this coming week. New Steelers defensive lineman Daniel Ikuale. So if you wanted to hear from him about what he thinks he can add to the D line, make sure to check that out. Also, story on him Sunday in the PG, written story. So.
Absolutely. Lots of great content. Keep it here with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette for all of it. We'll see you Monday on the North Shore Drive podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all the sports coverage from the Post-Gazette that we have to offer, visit post-gazette.com.